Hi everybody, so it's me, Courtney. This is week 11, Pisa and Mediterranean Memory, and in this video, part 1, I will be giving an overview of the readings for the week seminar. We had 4 of them, and to start off, I'm going to begin by covering Memory and Interpretation, New Approaches to the Study of the Crusades by Megan Cassidy Welch and Anne E. Lester. And this was published in the book Crusades and Memory, Rethinking Past and Present in 2015. So Megan Cassidy Welch is a professor of history at the University of Queensland, Australia. Her research explores the social and cultural history of the 13th century, particularly themes of space, memory, and war. Anne E. Lester is an associate professor of medieval history at Johns Hopkins University. Her research focuses on fragmentary sources collected primarily in French and European archival collections and libraries. So the article describes the connection between studies of memory and the history of the Crusades. They argue that integrating memory into Crusades scholarship offers new ways of exploring the aftermath of war, the construction of cultural memory, the role of women and families in this process, and the crusading movement itself. So they begin by talking about the history of memory, and it grew from work of generation of scholars we know of as the Annales School, and they focus on Maurice Halbach's study on collective memory. Memory is dependent upon the framework within which a group is situated in a society. Thus, there is not only an individual memory, but also a group memory that exists outside of and lives beyond the individual. And as a result, an individual's understanding of the past is strongly linked to the group consciousness. Halbach pursued to prove this idea of memory through people's expression of commemoration in our culture. And commemoration shows how collective memory is tied to society and its conceptions where physical monuments and rituals fix and affirm collectivity. And this idea is seen in the work of Pierre Nora, who believes memory was to be found in places or sites of memory. So like Halbach's, Nora was convinced of the social and political functions of memory. So later generations of the Annales School, they found connections between history and memory, some of which were built on visions of the medieval past, and they used World War I as an example. So after World War II, memory increasingly became of interest to historians. This sparked an interest in war memory or memory in the context of conflict. So literature on war memory, they see, Cassidy Welch and Lester see a problem because people assume that it is a product of modernity because collective memory in the postmodern world can form a nation state or like a national identity, but they argue that there is much to be gained by studying how memory worked in the past conflicts, specifically the Crusades, because collective memory can still define places and objects, as we see in the work of Maurice Halbach and Pierre Nora. So the historians try to bring together the concept of memory as a cognitive tool and the concept of remembrance as a set of cultural forms that bring into collective consciousness that things that have occurred in the past. The authors then give an overview of the historiography in Crusade studies. So recent work on Crusades reflect on the experience of crusading and its effect on culture, spirituality, identity, narrative, and perceptions of religious differences, among other topics. And the distinction Halbach uses to separate memory from remembrance is useful here because memory is the stitching together of isolated images, whereas remembrance is a social context that gives separate events and moments meaning and coherence. So in the scholarship of Crusades, it wasn't until the 1990s when Jonathan Riley Smith and Marcus Bull opened the question of the experience of crusading and related to this the motivation for going on crusade. So rather than seeing each crusade as a separate response to changes and threats in the East, it became possible to see the Crusades as a larger movement connected to and informing other religious movements. And the opening up of Crusader studies was also influenced by the events of 9/11. And then they go on to introduce the essays to follow in the publication. So moving on to the second essay this week by Sean Nelson, Relics of Christian Victory, the translation of Ottoman spolia in Grand Ducal Tuscany. This was published in 2016. So we all know Sean Nelson. He is our professor. He is a professor at Syracuse University of Florence. His research and his teaching interests focus on cross-cultural dialogue between early modern Florence and the Islamic lands, predominantly the Mamluk Sultanate and the Ottoman Empire. So in his essay, he argues that the Grand Dukes celebrated Christian victories over Islam through their translation of Ottoman spolia, aka war trophies, in Tuscany, specifically in Florence and Pisa. So little did I know before this essay that translation has two definitions, and the one Nelson uses in this context is to move something from one place to another. So I find this play on words, well, not so much play on words, but use of the two different definitions interesting and effective throughout his essay. So I'd be interested to see what you all have to say about that. So the Grand Dukes followed traditions of memorializing that originated in the Middle Ages during the Crusades, and the Dukes mostly relied on the Order of St. Stephen to collect these objects, and the spoils were viewed as metonyms or representations of the thousands of captured and defeated Ottomans. Flags and lanterns were displayed in churches while weapons were reserved for the Medici's arm and armor collection. And the inscriptions on flags played a larger role in contextualizing them as spoils because they reaffirmed their origins, and paired with the flags, the lanterns distinguish individual ships of a fleet. Ottoman weapons made up a huge part of the Medici collection, but unlike the flags, inventories and descriptions leave out Arabic inscriptions, and Nelson argues that the inscriptions may have helped clarify their role as spoils. And I'm also curious as to why they did not describe these inscriptions. I'm also wondering what you all have to think about that. So Nelson focuses on a room in the Medici collection where Turkish booty was displayed in the same room as Charlemagne's sword. And Charlemagne was envisioned as the defender of Christianity against the forces of Islam, and this is a point echoed in poems. And the sword displayed in the same room as the collection of Ottoman spolia, according to Nelson, served as a way of communicating the fulfillment of the greater duties of the Medici as Christian princes. And to conclude, Nelson restates his thesis and notes that many of the spoils are no longer preserved. They have either been auctioned off or melted down. Transitioning to the third reading, Marco Gemignani's The Navies of the Medici, the Florentine Navy, and Navy of the Sacred Order of St. Stephen from 1547 to 1648. This was published as a chapter in a book in 2003. And Gemignani is a professor of psychology at Duke Quinnesec University. Currently, his interdisciplinary research focuses on experiences of border crossing and sojourning, including international students, migrants, and refugees. So this book chapter provides a general history and context of the Florentine Navy in the second half of the 16th century, specifically its expansion and creation by the Medici of the Order of St. Stephen, which gradually merged with the Grand Duchy's navy in 1570. Within the time frame, in the 1570s, not the year 1570, excuse me. So within this time frame that Gemignani focuses on, he gives an overview of the naval operations under the command of Cosimo I, Francesco I, Ferdinando I, Cosimo II, and Ferdinando II. Some of these names obviously are familiar. We talked a lot about Francesco and Ferdinando last week with their affiliation with Livorno. So after the conquest of Pisa in 1406 and acquisition of Porto Pisano and Livorno in 1421, Florence gained direct access to the sea. and Cosimo I realized navies were acquiring increasing importance and felt necessary to create his own naval forces to gain greater recognition at an international level and to protect the coast of the state from Muslim raids. So to accomplish these goals, Cosimo I started construction of an arsenal in Pisa. He launched the first galley in 1547 and soon after added 3 more. And so he wished to create a military order to further strengthen the regional level state that he governed, and he was granted permission to do so by Pope Pius IV in 1562. So Cosimo I, as well as several of his successors, during this period that Gemignani focuses on, they treated the galleys like objects of exchange to be rented to Spain or Papal States to support matters of foreign policy. And Gemignani notes that by observing the nature of the Florentine navy and the navy of the order, it becomes clear that they were built to give the Medici greater importance in the international context. Cosimo I understood how important it was to have a fleet in the Mediterranean where tensions between Christians and Muslims were increasing. Gemignani contends that Cosimo I can be considered the father of the Medici navy of the period. And Gemignani reiterates the duties of the Florentine ships, which were to control the northern Tyrrhenian Sea, protect Tuscan coasts and merchant ships, attack Muslim warships and merchantmen, and, as I stated before, to act as objects of exchange between Cosimo I and his successors, and with Spain and the Papal States. Gemignani also notes that another purpose of creating the order was to create a link between Medici and the most important families of Tuscan nobility and of other Christian states. So moving on to the fourth reading, Infiltrating Artifacts, the Impact of Islamic Art in 14th and 15th Century Florence and Pisa. This was published in 2018, and the author, Vera Simone Schultz, is a research associate at the Kunst in Florence, and her areas of research include Florence in Italy in a Mediterranean and global perspective, Islamic art and architecture, and transcultural art history. And this paper discusses the impact of artifacts imported from the Islamic world on the image production of the 14th and 15th century Florence and Pisa. She presents two case studies, and the first case study, she focuses on a fresco of the Annunciation in the Annunziata in Florence, which we visited with monuments. And legend has it that the painter failed to represent the face of the Virgin, and it was miraculously painted by an angel. There is an Anatolian carpet at the Madonna's feet, and once an image cult developed around this miraculous image, it was widely copied, and so was the carpet. And Schultz notes that when placed on a floor, rugs delimit an area, so think of celebrities on the red carpet. In this scene, the rug connects Mary and the angel and indicates sacred territory on which and across the miracle of the Annunciation occurs. And by the 15th century, Oriental carpets were Florentinized through painting. So in Florence, this signified not only a local reference to the miraculous image, but also to the Mediterranean networks of this city. So the second case study focuses on metalwork from Mamluk Syria and Egypt found in paintings in Florence and Pisa. So there was a high appreciation of metalwork, but it was rarely represented in Italian art. So they focus on, Schultz focuses on Masaccios Pisa Polyptych from 1426 because his halo on the Virgin features Arabic and Pseudo-Arabic letters, and a specific object has been proposed as inspiration for the halos featuring pseudoscript, and that's Mamluk brass plates. So Schultz believes that the fact that a Florentine artist, when representing halos for his altarpiece destined for a church in Pisa, took inspiration from Mamluk metalwork testifies to the highly complex trans-urban, trans-regional, and transcultural networks that were at play. So to conclude, Schultz reiterates that both case studies elucidated intersections between material and visual culture in Florence and Pisa from a Mediterranean perspective, and that in the discipline of Italian art history, the study of artistic response to antique art and architecture is highly developed, whereas receptions of Islamic artifacts have only recently received attention. And that's all for part 1. Stay tuned for part 2. Bye!